Hey everyone, and thanks for taking the time to check out this video. For today's presentation, we're going to be taking on a totally new subject for this channel, which is Swedish battle rifles. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the M96, AGM42, and AK4 families of rifles and looking at examples of each. As always, I'll try to weave in historical context, mechanical properties, collector considerations, and really whatever else I can think of in order to offer an educational and hopefully entertaining glimpse into these unique weapon systems. Additionally, it is my hope that through exploring the progressive design goals of battle rifles from one specific region, we can learn something about the evolution of the battle rifle role more generally. I'm personally excited for this one, so let's jump right in. When we think about historic military powers and iconic small arms producers, we generally don't think of Sweden. Despite their status as being the direct descendants of one of the most infamous warrior civilizations in history, of course I'm referring to the Vikings, the Swedes have been exceptionally successful at avoiding armed conflict in the modern era. In fact, the nation itself has not been to war since 1814, which is pretty hard to contextualize as an American. Now, to be clear, some Swedish soldiers have seen combat during that time, but always in a limited capacity and while attached to a belligerent third party, whether formally or informally. The point is, it really may be fitting that the Nobel Peace Prize is named after Alfred Nobel, a citizen of one of the more peaceful nations in recent history. As a brief aside, I think it's really fascinating to look at contemporary Swedish politics through that historical lens, as at the time of filming, Sweden is on the brink of joining the military alliance NATO, which represents a truly profound departure from more than 2 centuries of fierce neutrality. Once again, this is a country that refused to directly involve themselves in either World War or pick sides during the Cold War, and here they are today positioning themselves to be a single Article 5 invocation away from declaration of war. That's a really big deal when you think about it, and a poignant example of how the study of historical firearms can provide rich and extremely relevant context for the world we live in today. Beyond just Sweden's military history, or lack thereof perhaps, I think it's also prudent to take this opportunity to briefly celebrate a few of the gifts Swedish culture has shared with the rest of the world. After all, I'm not sure the next time I'll be talking about Sweden on this channel. I personally grew up in a hockey family, which means that many of my earliest idols were Swedes, including Peter Forsberg, Mats Sundin, Nicklas Lidström, Henrik Zetterberg, and the Sedin twins. And if you're thinking triangle, nobody cares about Swedish hockey players, you have to remember that a significant percentage of my audience is Canadian, and some of them are freaking out right now. In any case, I'm pretty sure many of my elementary school teachers were confused as to why a short beige kid was always wearing Swedish flag patches. I've been told my ethnicity is hard to pin down, but if there's one thing I'm obviously not, it's Swedish. In addition to phenomenal athletes and tall, fair-skinned people, Sweden is also responsible for such delights as cinnamon rolls, Stieg Larsson books, and of course dynamite, which ironically was also invented by Alfred Nobel. But we aren't here to talk about those things today or any of the other presumably numerous things which Sweden has contributed to global society, but rather to talk about their weapons. So let's steer the ship back in that direction. Unlike some of the other generally neutral countries I've discussed on this channel, Sweden has demonstrated a healthy grasp of the old Kafka adage, better to have and not need than to need and not have. For my fellow American viewers who are raised by a different breed of literary virtuoso, that's European for stay strapped or get clapped. Although Sweden still regrettably wastes the majority of their national budget on frivolous things like social services and the 7th highest standard of living on the planet, they still recognize defense spending as an important consideration and have been involved with the development of some interesting and well-regarded weapon systems over the years. Of course, these days with the war in Ukraine, we primarily hear about their indigenous fighter, the JAS-39 Gripen C. However, the Swedish Ministry of Defense has rudely ignored my T&E requests for 4th-generation fighter aircraft, so for the purpose of this video, we are instead going to talk about 3 families of much more easily sourced, yet still distinctly Swedish battle rifles. As previously stated, these 3 families of battle rifles are going to be the M96, the AGM42, and the AK4. In my opinion, each of these rifles corresponds to a global shift in warfighting tactics and small arms technology, and each represents what I consider to be a unique but brilliant solution to a well-established problem. So let's go ahead and hit them one at a time, starting with the M96. The M96 rifle pattern traces its origin, as so many bolt-action rifles do, to the smokeless powder revolution of the 1880s and 1890s. As a brief refresher, the period of time I'm referring to here is when the advent of clean and slow-burning nitrocellulose-based propellants totally shattered the understood performance ceiling of conventional weapon systems. High-velocity, small-diameter jacketed projectiles essentially tripled the effective range of riflemen overnight, and the combat viability of manually operated repeating firearms went from dubious to essential. There was a mad flurry of competition and innovation, and engineers from all over the world raced to create platforms based around these new capabilities. This period represented the birth of some of the most iconic first-generation manually operated smokeless battle rifles we know today, such as the Mauser pattern, Mosin pattern, Enfield pattern, and so many others. The Swedish M96, as you will see shortly, falls into the Mauser pattern. Sweden was a relatively proactive investor in smokeless technology, kicking off trials sometime around 1892. Now, friends of this channel may remember that early adopters of such weapons were not always rewarded for their foresight, as many countries that standardized on the earliest iterations of this technology ended up watching their designs become rapidly outclassed by the improved models which came out only a handful of years later. What makes Sweden relatively unique in this mad scramble is that they were one of the earlier adopters to actually end up with an effective and enduring design, and there are really 3 reasons for that. First, Sweden chose to do business with Paul Mauser and the Waffenfabrik Mauser Company. Without going too deep into the pros and cons of all the patterns they could have adopted, I think it's clear that partnering with Mauser was the best choice for Sweden, especially compared to the vastly inferior Norwegian Krag that would have been a more obvious choice from a regional and cultural perspective. Second, Sweden was patient and deliberate in their adoption process. Technically, Sweden began adopting Mauser designs in 1892. However, they did not place huge orders until 1896, by which time the technology had sufficiently matured. Third and finally, Sweden collaborated with Norway to develop their own indigenous smokeless powder cartridge, the 6.5 Patron M94, or 6.5 by 55mm cartridge. I'll talk about this again in a moment, but for now let me just say that the 6.5 by 55 is arguably one of the most elegantly designed and underrated cartridges in human history, and the fact that the Swedes figured that out in 1894 is nothing short of astounding. In any case, all this amounted to the M96 pattern long rifle, a German-designed small-ring cock-on-close Mauser pattern rifle made of premium-grade Swedish steel chambered in a phenomenally utilitarian cartridge. All that is a long way of saying they got a really solid rifle for their efforts, but let's go ahead and go longer with that explanation still. In terms of design, the Swedish M96 is very similar to the Spanish M1893 and the Chilean M1895, which is to say it is a highly effective and proven design. It's not quite as strong as the later 1898 pattern, but it corrects the major problems which were present in the 1889 and 1891 models, which some early adopters like the Belgians and Argentines got stuck with in large numbers. The features I'm talking about are the single-stack protruding magazines, push-feed loading, and what is this, an extractor for ants? It must be at least 5 times bigger. On top of this fundamentally sound design, the materials and build quality of the M96 are excellent. The rifles were made initially in both Germany and Sweden, later only in Sweden. However, regardless of where they were made, the specs called for Swedish steel, which was widely regarded as one of the best grades of steel on the planet at that time. I encourage viewers to keep in mind that modern alloys and stamping technology did not exist in the late 19th century, so the natural composition of iron ore made a big deal in the strength and corrosion resistance of steel products. Swedish iron ore contains elevated levels of nickel, copper, and vanadium, which resulted in a product of superior quality. Finally, back to that cartridge. 6.5 by 55mm is basically 6.5 Creedmoor in a slightly longer case. In fact, if you know your American cartridge history, it would be perfectly appropriate to say that 6.5 Swedish is to 6.5 Creedmoor what 30-06 M2 Ball is to 7.62 NATO. It's the same ballistic profile, later redesigned to cycle in a shorter action. 6.5 Creedmoor is arguably the most successful and compelling cartridge to have been developed so far in the 21st century, 2007 to be specific, and indeed is so successful that it directly inspired the 277 Fury cartridge, which the US formally adopted in 2019. If you ask anybody what the future of modern fighting rifle chamberings is, they will probably tell you that full power 6.5 to 6.8mm-ish diameter cartridges are at the very least part of the conversation, which is mind-blowing to me because the Swedish apparently had that figured out 130 years ago. The 6.5 Swedish is extremely soft recoiling for a battle rifle cartridge. It flies as flat as a laser beam, it carries its energy exceptionally well, and it's inherently accurate. Compared to a 7.62 NATO, it has about 25% less muzzle energy, and that's where the recoil reduction comes into play. Yet between 500 and 1,000 yards, the 6.5 actually overtakes the 7.62 in retained kinetic energy, and it maintains stable supersonic flight for an additional 300 yards or so. Now, I'm sure many of you are sick of hearing about just how awesome the 6.5 Creedmoor is, but however annoying its proponents might be, their math is fundamentally correct, and everything that sets the Creedmoor apart from the 308 is also true of 6.5 Swedish. So one last time, the M96 rifle is really quite good. Aside from uninspired Mauser-style sights, it's really one of the best manually operated battle rifles of the era, and there's a reason that they are so commonly seen on the podiums of long-range CNR matches, although of course Swiss K31s, Finnish M39s, and American M1917s will usually keep those competitions interesting. Now some of you might be thinking to yourself, Triangle, you idiot. That's not an M96, and you are right, of course. Well, you're right about it not being an M96. I'd like to think the jury is still out on whether or not I'm an idiot. The M96 is the original long rifle configuration, and this is the M38 short rifle variant adopted in, you guessed it, 1938. They are fundamentally the same rifle, although the M96 has a 29-inch barrel and the M38 reduces that to what I consider to be a far more pragmatic 24 inches. I used to personally own a smattering of M96 and M38 rifles, but due to personal preference, all I have left is M38s, and I'll speak to that more in a moment. The M38 comes in two varieties, the M38 Type 1 and the M38 Type 2. Type 1s were made by converting original M96 rifles, whereas Type 2s were purpose-built from the ground up. This is the reason you will sometimes see Type 1 rifles referred to as 96/38s in the collector community. This is not a historically accurate term to my knowledge, but it reflects an accurate understanding of what these rifles are, and that's why I think it's fair to consider the M38 to still belong to the M96 pattern. Other differences include the fact that Type 2s were made by Husqvarna, yes, the very same Husqvarna that made your chainsaw, and introduced a bent bolt handle. Type 1s maintain their original maker marks, which means either Carl Gustaf Stads Rifle Factory or Mauser Oberndorf, and preserve the straight bolt handle of the M96s they were made from. Type 1s are also sometimes found with the Metalwerken Vostris micrometer adjustable rear sights. Say that one 5 times fast. I love these sights because they look super cool and are technically an improvement over the sliding ladders, although in total fairness, I think crudely welding a rear aperture sight would have been a more functional improvement if that's really what the Swedes were going for. With all that said, let's briefly talk about collector considerations. Should you get an M96 pattern Swedish Mauser to include the M38? Short answer, yes. Long answer, yes, yes, a million times yes. The M38 Type 1 is actually my personal favorite historic long gun of all time, yes, even more so than the SKS. They absolutely drip with Nordic soul and old world craftsmanship, they balance perfectly in the hand, and they are a delight to shoot. On top of all of that, they are still pretty easy to find and reasonably well priced as far as CNR bolt guns go, especially considering that they are one of the best in the category. 6.5 by 55mm ammunition isn't as easy to find as NATO standard rounds, but it's much easier to find than Japanese or Italian rounds. And the nice thing about bolt actions is you don't need a ton of ammo to have a good time at the range. I actually credit this exact rifle for truly inspiring my love and obsession with CNR, as it was the first rifle that actually talked to me and made me realize that collecting guns was inherently a spiritual and humanistic pursuit. Now, although the M38 Type 1 is my personal favorite, really all of the Swedish Mausers are excellent. I don't find the fit and finish of the Type 2s to be nearly as good as the Type 1s, nor do I care for bent bolt handles with iron sights, but a lot of that is personal preference, and at the end of the day, the Type 2s are really just as good where it counts. I personally find the M96 long rifles to be a bit cumbersome. They don't balance the same way in my arms, but I'm not a big guy, and at the end of the day, it is still the same rifle, so it is excellent. Many far more accomplished shooters than myself seem to prefer the M96 for accuracy, although I've always found the M38s to shoot a little bit better in my hands. Finally, the M94 carbine variants and M41 snipers are super cool, but are usually a bit more on the niche and spendy side. Last thing in this section, let's just say a few words about the combat provenance of these rifles. As with any modern Swedish weapon, very few of these have ever fired a shot in anger. However, a small number of Swedish volunteers did carry M96 long rifles while fighting the Soviets in Finland during the Winter War and Continuation War of the 1930s and 40s. These rifles can be identified by an SA property mark on the receiver. It's also worth noting that the Swedish Mauser Wikipedia page claims these rifles saw use in Ireland's Easter Rising. However, this is a conflict of great personal interest to me, and never in my relatively exhaustive readings have I found any indication of where this claim comes from. I've heard rumors of some old Swedish rolling block rifles being used in the early days of the Irish Troubles, but never the Mauser patterns. If you happen to have any additional information on this claim, I'd greatly appreciate fresh reading material. Alright, that was the M96 pattern, so now let's go ahead and jump forward about half a century and see how the Swedes navigated a second renaissance in battle rifle technology with the AG M42 Ljungman. When we left our story, the Swedes had developed the M38 short rifle variant of the M96 long rifle, which was consistent with a global shift towards shorter barrels on manually operated battle rifles. There was, however, another global shift picking up momentum in the late 1930s, and that was, of course, the movement towards first-generation auto-loading battle rifles for general issue. While auto-loading firearms had technically existed since the advent of smokeless powder, no one had yet figured out how to mass-produce and issue an auto-loading battle rifle that matched the size, weight, and dependability of the bolt-action standards. Yes, there were a few forward-leaning designs such as the Remington Model 8, the Mexican Mondragon, the Russian Fedorov, the MLE 1917 from France. However, it really wasn't until the eve of the Second World War that nations got serious about auto-loading battle rifle development. As a quick aside, in case anyone doesn't know exactly what I'm talking about here, auto-loading in this context basically just means semi-automatic, which has enormous implications for positive outcomes in combat. On an individual level, auto-loading battle rifles increase hit probability by allowing shooters to essentially walk rounds on target, as they are able to miss, rapidly readjust, and re-engage without losing their sight picture or missing their target window. Perhaps of even greater consequence, auto-loading battle rifles allow elements of any size to achieve fire superiority much more easily, which translates to greater maneuverability on the battlefield and ultimately winning engagements. To massively oversimplify how small arms-based combat works, the side that makes the most loud noises and puts the most lead in the air usually wins, and autoloaders make it much easier to make loud noises and put lead in the air. Credit to Sweden, once again they recognized the importance of this technology relatively early, and they were one of very few countries in the world who managed to successfully develop and adopt such a rifle during World War II. It probably helped they weren't actually fighting in the war, and therefore their manufacturing infrastructure was under much less stress. However, either way, it's an impressive accomplishment, especially considering that unlike their M96 Mauser, they actually designed this weapon mostly on their own. This weapon was, of course, the AG-M42 Ljungman, one of the strangest and most delightful auto-loading rifles of the era. As a brief note, sometimes you will hear these referred to as AG-42s, sometimes you'll hear them referred to just as Ljungmans. All of those are perfectly appropriate terms, and people will know what you're talking about if you use them, but for the purpose of this video, I am using what I believe is the closest to the correct Swedish designation, which is AG-M42, or Automatgewehr semi-automatic rifle, model 1942. So what can we say about the AG-M42? In terms of its positive qualities, there are really two that immediately jump out at me. First, it is a generally decent rifle that fundamentally works. That might sound like a low bar, but it's really quite impressive in context. Many countries tried to create an autoloading battle rifle around this time, and most of them failed. I'd personally argue that at its time of adoption, the AG-M42 was the second best battle rifle on the planet, trailing only the legendary US M1 Garand. Even if you don't agree with that opinion, you can practically count all the other halfway decent first-generation autoloading battle rifles on one hand anyway, so it's hard to argue that Sweden's accomplishment didn't at least put them in an elite peer group. That the US, USSR, Germany, Belgium, and France managed to make it happen shouldn't be terribly surprising, but that they would be rubbing elbows with Sweden kind of is, and yet that's exactly what happened. The second obvious quality of the AG-M42 is that it retains the 6.5 by 55mm cartridge, so all of the praises I've sung for that round so far still apply. Additionally, now that autoloading capability is part of the equation, that lighter recoil of the 6.5 Swedish now translates to a significantly faster rate of fire than contemporary autoloaders chambered in 30-06, 8mm Mauser, or 54 rimmed. Here you see a clip of me hammering away with an AG-M42, followed by an FN-49 chambered in 8mm Mauser. The difference in effective rate of fire is obvious, and it's something we really couldn't appreciate back when this round was stuck in a manually operated action. In terms of the drawback of the Ljungman, the main one that jumps out to me is that it's long and inefficient. It's extremely cumbersome compared to the M1 Garand, and yet it doesn't actually have that much longer of a barrel, and indeed it has a much shorter sight radius with vastly inferior sights, and none of that is what you want in a battle rifle design. Beyond those noteworthy but modest attractions, the design is very interesting and really unlike anything that came before it. While the AG-M42 was clearly inspired, at least in part, by a Soviet SVT-38 captured by the Swedes' eastern neighbors in Finland, much of the design is truly original. This is a pure direct gas impingement operated system, which does a great job of taking the edge off the already soft recoil. The tilting bolt and floating carrier system are fairly bizarre and unlike anything I've seen before, and they have a violent locking feature which makes Garand thumb look like a preferable outcome. Like all first-generation autoloading battle rifles, the Ljungman was issued with only one magazine, and although this magazine is technically detachable, it was intended to be top-fed with standard 5-round Mauser stripper clips. By the way, these Swedish clips are still very cheap and can be used in a wide variety of Mausers, as 6.5 by 55 has essentially the same case head as 30-06. In terms of comparing the overall effectiveness of the AG M42 to its direct competitors, that's pretty speculative because obviously the rifle didn't see combat use in World War II. Sweden avoided direct hostilities, and there is no evidence that these rifles saw any use in Finland or Norway. It should be noted, however, that the core design of the AG M42 did ultimately prove itself in combat, as the Swedes sold the design to Egypt, who kept the Ljungman alive in the form of the Hakim and Rasheed rifles, chambered in 8mm Mauser and 7.62x39 respectively. Although these rifles were pretty much obsolete before they even went into production, they were still capable enough for Middle Eastern conflict and have been used effectively in that region to the present day. When we factor in the modest but real combat accolades of the Hakim and Rasheed, I think it's fair to say the core AG M42 design was sound, which again is really impressive considering just how early it was developed. Sure, it's easy to critique the Ljungman, Hakim, and Rasheed in comparison to second-generation autoloading battle rifles and first-generation assault rifles, but we really need to remember that none of those categories of firearms existed in 1942. So once again, credit to the Swedes for being way ahead of the pack. Of course, I'll be circling back to the importance of second-generation autoloading battle rifles in a minute, as that will be a smooth segue to the AK4 series. But before we move on, let's just cover a few collector considerations. Should you get one of these things? That's a lot less clear to me. Unless you really like Swedish weapons, I'd say this is an easy one to pass over. Don't get me wrong, these are extremely cool, and this was one of my personal grail guns. I can't imagine ever letting it go, but they are pretty expensive for what is a fairly obscure niche. Only about 30,000 of these things were made, so they aren't the easiest to find. Yes, they shoot well, but it's not obviously a more pleasant shooting experience than a Swedish Mauser, and it's certainly a more expensive experience. Not only do I have a tendency to shoot more rounds through this rifle than I would through a manually operated rifle, but the other thing with the AG42s is that they can have a tendency to chew up the brass a little bit, which is a hidden expense that can really add up. Some people forget that fired brass in specialty cartridges like 6.5 Swedish has significant value, so the cost per trigger pull on a rifle that destroys that brass is much higher than on a rifle that does not, even when you're shooting exactly the same ammo. Don't get me wrong, these are super cool rifles that I highly recommend, but there are a lot of super cool rifles that I highly recommend at that price point. So unless you are fabulously wealthy or have a specialized interest in this platform, as I do, it probably won't be at the top of your list. Also, it should be noted that virtually all AG M42 patterns on the US civilian market are AG M42B variants, which have the upgraded stainless steel gas tubes and better ergonomic features. Technically, an unmodified AG M42 would probably be worth much, much more, but the AG M42B is definitely a superior weapon if you're actually going to shoot it. All right, and with that, we've wrapped up the AG M42 Ljungman, so let's move into the final section of this video, the AK4. As we established in the last section, the AG M42 stands out as being one of the world's only successfully developed first-generation autoloading battle rifles, an impressive but short-lived accomplishment. The reason I say short-lived is because the events of World War II catalyzed yet another revolution in small arms technology, which was the popularization of features like pistol grips, fire selection, and detachable box magazines. As revolutionary as first-generation autoloading battle rifles were, their window of viability closed rapidly, as first-generation intermediate rifle caliber assault rifles like the STG-44 and Kalashnikov burst onto the scene. Full-power battle rifles didn't disappear, however that first generation was rapidly replaced with second-generation autoloading battle rifles, which incorporated all of the features of an assault rifle minus its intermediate rifle cartridge. Even the king of the first generation, the M1 Garand, was rapidly showing its age as new kids on the block like the FAL, SETME, M14, and AR-10 began to dominate. The Swedish weren't exactly on the leading edge of development anymore, but in 1965 they did acquire a license to produce 7.62 NATO chambered G3 pattern rifles under the model designation AK4, which was certainly an economical yet respectable choice. Now, this video isn't about economic and respectable choices, it's about flashes of brilliance. And in order to understand the brilliance of the AK4, we need to talk about one final technological leap. As esteemed and effective as second-generation autoloading battle rifles were throughout the Cold War and beyond, they too eventually began to show their age, especially with the growing importance of modern enablers such as electro-optical aiming systems, infrared lasers, suppressors, grenade launchers, and the modular rail systems which made all of that possible. This spawned what I consider to be the third generation of autoloading battle rifles, which were intended to make use of exactly those modern enablers. Purpose-built third-generation battle rifles like the FN SCAR emerged. However, modernization packages were also developed in order to try to push legacy second-generation systems into third-generation roles. Some platforms like the AR-10 were naturally receptive to these packages and made that jump effortlessly. Other weapons like the M14 offered more resistance, but ultimately proved successful enough in the EBR program. And then there were other weapons like the FAL, which simply failed to adapt to these 21st century requirements. Now, while the Swedish hadn't done a lot to push second-generation technology, they were one of many countries that had G3s, and they took an active leadership role in deciding exactly where the G3 was going to fall on that spectrum. In one final feat of battle rifle brilliance, the Swedes managed to squeeze the historically denigrated HK design somewhere between the EBR and the modernized AR-10, which is to say they were pretty darn successful at modernizing it. The crux of Swedish innovation here was a drop-in stock system designed by the Swedish firm Spuhr AB. Spuhr realized that G3 ergonomics had been compromised from the start in order to accommodate proper iron sight alignment, and by replacing the iron sights with a welded Picatinny rail, they were able to combine modern targeting and inline recoil impulse, dramatically improving the handling and combat effectiveness of the G3 platform. The AK4 model with the upgraded stock was designated the AK4C, and when later an enabler-capable handguard was offered, the weapon was designated AK4D. Through this program, the Swedes were able to preserve the legendary reliability and inherent accuracy of the roller-delayed G3, correct its biggest ergonomic flaws, and integrate third-generation capabilities, all without having to invest in an entirely new platform or development cycle. Once again, this is a pretty impressive feat on the part of the Swedes, especially considering that they weren't motivated by the immediate prospect of war. That's what I call priorities. In terms of real-world use, the AK4D is actually one of the few Swedish weapons that has seen a little bit of combat. In recent memory, Sweden has contributed some forces to UN peacekeeping missions, as well as the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, and some of their elite marksmen did bring AK4Ds into these conflict zones. Additionally, the Portuguese Marines adopted the Swedish Spuhr AB upgrade package for their own G3 patterns, and for those that don't know, the Portuguese are highly underrated door kickers who have a well-earned reputation for coming home with empty magazines and hot barrels. Point being, these things absolutely work in modern combat, and while they might not be the first choice for countries that can budget for purpose-built Gen 3s, they absolutely still check the essential boxes. To borrow the epic Brian Scalabrine quote, "I'm way closer to Kobe than you are to me," except in this case, Brian is the AK4D, Kobe is the FN SCAR 17, and you are the FAL. So really the last thing to talk about here, of course, is collector considerations, and this is going to be a very different conversation than the last two, because put simply, you probably aren't going to get your hands on a real Swedish-made AK4D, so now we're talking about a clone build, and that word clone is being used pretty loosely. For most people who want something like an AK4D, you are probably going to end up with something like this. What I have here is a PTR91 GIR, which is a US-made version of the HK91, which itself is a Title I version of the G3. Of course, there are other options out there. You could use a real HK91, you could use a Greek-made Springfield SAR3, you could use a parts kit, but at the end of the day, the one thing you probably won't be able to use is an actual Swedish-made AK4, so keep that in mind. Luckily, the Spuhr stock and handguard are pretty easy to find in the US. However, at about $300 a piece, easy to find and easy to own aren't necessarily the same thing. In the case of my build, you will note that I opted to forsake the Spuhr handguard for a US handguard made by Midwest Industries. Obviously, this is a tick away from clone correctness, but it's way more functional for my purposes. Not only is the Midwest rail significantly cheaper, but it uses industry standard M-lock, whereas the Spuhr stock uses a proprietary mounting system which will rapidly add to the already steep price tag. Also, to be honest, I just love Midwest as a company. They're one of my favorite US manufacturers. I'm almost always happy with their products, and I try to give them my business whenever I can. I wish I could say they paid me to say that, but that's just the truth. That said, I do have the correct Spuhr stock, and while I'm not sure it's worth the price tag compared to cheaper US-made AR buffer stock adapters, it is phenomenally well made, so once again, credit to the Swedes for that. I do also have a clone correct optic on here, at least for the AK4C model, which is the Aimpoint Comp M4. Obviously an extremely well-known optic to GWAT era US personnel like myself who know it as the M68 CCO, or Close Combat Optic. That said, as much affection as we Americans have for Aimpoint products, remember that Aimpoint is itself also a Swedish company, so there's a strong argument that the AK4 actually has a stronger claim to this optic than even my beloved M4A1. And altogether, I think this creates a pretty solid facsimile of the AK4D. It's not a cheap gun by any stretch of the imagination, but when you compare it to other civilian legal third generation autoloading battle rifles, it's definitely on the lower side of the price spectrum. I won't talk too much about the real-world performance of this reproduction rifle, in part because I don't have a ton of experience with it yet. It's a relatively new build for me, but if you would like to learn more, I would be remiss to not note that 3 of my personal favorite YouTube channels have covered similar builds extensively, those being Forgotten Weapons, 9-Hole Reviews, and the utterly unpronounceable channel that we shortened to HOP. Ian and Henry had overwhelmingly positive things to say about their PTR-based AK4D reproductions. In fact, Ian has some excellent and very recent content showing himself running a similar setup at Finnish Brutality 2023. Hop, on the other hand, was much more critical. However, Hop is an extremely critical reviewer, and I think it's relevant to note that his perspectives are geared towards optimal performance in distinctly civilian applications, whereas I think that Ian and Henry's expectations were much more in line with the objective historical intent of the rifle, which recognizes that certain performance thresholds are less critical and less apparent in combat than they might be on the one-way range. Again, I'm a huge fan of Hop's content as well. I'm just not sure that his public interest and shooting style really intersect with the dimension in which the AK4D really shines, or at the very least proves its viability. All that said, I don't think many civilians put together an AK4D-esque rifle as a go-to fighting rifle, not because it can't fit that role, it absolutely can, but because from a single end-user perspective, there are probably higher speed choices for the money. I think that most people who set up a rifle like this, and I'm certainly including myself in that category, do so because they think it will be entertaining, and it absolutely delivers on that. The AK4D is everything you might hope for from a battle rifle. In a world of ultralight gamer guns, sometimes it feels nice to just pick up a proper sledgehammer, and that's what the AK4D is. It's really just a whole lot of manly battle rifle fun. All right, and that's the video, guys. This was a fun one for me, but I don't need to write scripts and edit videos to have fun. So if you enjoyed the video, please consider hitting like, subscribe, or comment. That's what's going to motivate me to make the next one. As a quick point of housekeeping, this is my first video with a new mic. I've got a few requests to get my audio sorted out. I've gone through a few cheaper mics. I've actually got a quality mic now, and I'm hoping this resolved those issues. So if it did or didn't, please let me know. Although I'm guessing I'll get a sense myself while editing the video. Other than that, thanks again for taking the time to check out this video, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.